Welcome to the Camassia Nightrobe Sew-Along video, a pattern by Sewillow available on Etsy. In this video I will be making view B in a silk velvet, but to make the velvet easier to work with and the inside of the robe comfortable, I have chosen to underline the robe with a pure cotton block print fabric. As I have made this pattern before, I already have the traced pattern pieces ready for use. You can see how to print pattern pieces in my first sew-along video for the Scylla jumpsuit. As velvet is notoriously slippery, I'm using a temporary adhesive spray to join the cotton and velvet fabrics with wrong sides facing. I have added details in the description. Now that my velvet is stabilized, I'm carefully pinning the pattern pieces to the velvet side. Note that due to the slippery nature of velvet, I'm not cutting any of the pieces on the fold, but instead flipping my pattern pieces to avoid folding the fabric. Here you can see I'm cutting out one half of the back piece before I'll mark the midline and flip my pattern. Then I continue to cut the front pieces separately, again flipping the pattern for the opposite side. And now onto the sleeves. Again I'll need to mark the mid or fold line before flipping the pattern pieces. Also make sure to check the nap of the velvet to ensure you're cutting your opposite sleeves with a nap in the same direction. With the back, the two front and the sleeve pieces cut from the cotton lined fabric, I'm now going to continue cutting pockets from the cotton fabric only. And then I'm cutting the neckband and two front bands from the cotton too. I've chosen to stabilize the cotton band pieces with an iron-on interfacing. I've sewn the two front bands to either side of the back neckband and pressed open the seams. I'm then folding the whole neckband in half lengthways and pressing again. As part of my preparation steps, I'm finishing the raw edges of my pocket pieces with an overlocker. Now for the main velvet pieces that I'm underlining. Although I have used the spray adhesive to keep these layers together, I'm also going to pin lengthways all the way around the edges to make sure the velvet does not slip around when overlocking these edges together. I'm carefully removing the pins as I sew. Using a 3 cm wide strip of velvet fabric, I'm folding it in half with right sides facing and pinning lengthways to prevent the velvet from slipping. I'm then sewing up these edges using a 5 mm seam allowance before turning the strip inside out using the blunt end of a kebab stick. And now I'm cutting the strip into 3 10 cm long pieces to make the 2 belt loops and the neck loop. Using positioning markings from the pattern pieces and with right sides facing, I'm pinning the straight edge of the pockets to the outer side edges of the robe. I'm also going to pin the belt loops just above the pockets before basting with a sewing machine. The neck loop is pinned and basted to the center of the back neckline on the cotton or wrong side of the robe. I then trim away any excess bits. On the wrong sides of the 2 front pieces only, I'm finger pressing the seam allowance towards the pocket sides and understitching to secure these seams. This will prevent the pockets from spilling out when worn. Time for construction. With right sides facing, I start by matching the shoulder edges of the front pieces to the shoulder edges of the back pieces. I'm using clips. I found they worked quite well with the velvet. I'm sewing all my seams with a straight stitch and using the pattern's 10 mm seam allowance. I'm opening out the shoulder seams from the previous step with the velvet side up. Marking the midpoint on the sleeve cap curve, I'm matching and clipping the sleeve cap into the sleeve opening. Remember that you need to ease the curves together for these steps. Once the sleeves have been sewn in, I can now, with right sides facing and pockets open, match and clip together the lower sleeve edges up to the armpits and down the sides of the robe, clipping all the way around the pockets down to the side slit edge. before sewing along these edges. When sewing the side seams, as you get to the pockets, stitch 10 millimeters past the edge where the pockets joins, then turn to sew around the pocket edge. At this stage, I like to check that the belt loops work and that the fit and drape is working too. I'm loving how the velvet drapes and the underlining is giving the robe a nice bit of inner structure. For the lower hems, I initially tried to use bias binding strips to neaten the overlocked edges, but to be honest, it added too much bulk, so I unpicked those and opted instead for a simple single folded hem using the blind hem stitch on my sewing machine. I also metered the inner corners of the hems. This gives a really neat finish on the inside edge. Opening out the folded neckband, and with right sides facing, I'm matching the neckband seams to the shoulder seams of the robe and clipping this band all the way from one front edge to the other before sewing in place using the 10 mm seam allowance. Back at my ironing board, I'm now going to fold and press a very narrow hem on the inner edge side of the neckband. This means that when I fold the neckband in half again, this edge will be longer so that when I stitch in the ditch along the outer front neckband, I will be catching the longer side of the inside edge of the neckband. I'm avoiding any top stitching on this make because it doesn't really work well with velvet. For the lower corners, I'm simply sewing those edges right sides together before turning them out. Then I'm carefully stitching in the ditch from the front side where the neckband meets the velvet. Take your time doing this neatly, it's worth the end result. At this stage, I noticed that unlike the cotton version of the robe, the weight of the velvet made the drop shoulder look a little bit sloppy, so I toyed with the idea of gathering the tops of the shoulders and loved how it looked. I simply gathered the fabric by hand and then secured the gathers with a sewing machine. Now to finish the sleeve edges. I used 4 cm wide bias strips, sewn right sides facing to the outer edges of the sleeves using the 10 mm seam allowance. I then folded around a 7 mm hem on the strips and folded the strips over to the inside of the sleeve and clipped to secure. I then stitched close to the folded edge on the inside of the sleeve. These bias bound edges gives the sleeve a beautiful weighted drape. I didn't quite have enough fabric for the plaited robe belt, so I made a simple flat robe belt with one strip of velvet cut at 8 cm wide and a matching strip of cotton. I sewed these strips together along the outer edges, leaving a small gap for turning, and then finished the open edge by hand sewing an invisible seam stitch. Although working with velvet has its challenges and I have had to deviate a little bit from the original pattern instructions, I can honestly say I'm over the moon with how this has turned out. I hope this video inspires you to create something beautifully made and mindfully made in colours and fabrics that you love. Please click the like button or leave me a comment if you too have been inspired to sew the Camassia night robe. You can purchase the pattern from the Sewillow Etsy store. The pattern is available in a size small to XXXL, and the instructions include illustrated step-by-step guidance.